everyone. Welcome, welcome. Just make sure that everyone's been able to come in there from the waiting room just before we kick off today's session here. Hope everyone survived the snow if you're within Ontario. It's been a little bananas this January, so 145 days, I think, until summer. Who's counting? All right. So hopefully everyone has joined us now, but maybe we'll get started here. So welcome to today's webinar, using HR metrics to drive organizational effectiveness. This webinar is brought to you by Queen's University IRC. My name's Lindsay Van Zulen, and I'm the IRC Sales and Marketing Manager here. I'll be your moderator for today's exciting session. To begin, let us acknowledge that Queens is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee First Peoples Territory. We make this statement in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous presence here, which dates back over 100 years. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. So before we dive into today's session, I would like to take a moment here just to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar will be recorded, so if you do need to leave early or you miss a part of today's presentation, a link of the recording will be provided to you following today's session. Secondly, please feel free to submit any questions that you have throughout the session using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will save all questions to the end of today's presentation. Now, please join me in welcoming our facilitator for today's webinar, Lola Obamagay, who will guide us in moving beyond reporting and using HR metrics to influence decisions and drive meaningful organizational results. Lola is an accomplished, results-driven HR and healthcare executive and Vice President of People, Culture, and Organizational Effectiveness at a regional healthcare organization. With nearly 20 years of experience across the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors in England and Ontario, she brings deep expertise in culture, people leadership, and organizational effectiveness, and she's a strong advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Lola holds a Bachelor of Science honors degree in Economics and Statistics and a Master of Science in Human Resource Management. She is designated with CHRE, CHE, CAPMP, and MCIPD. Lola is a mother, a wife, and is completing the Rotman Global Executive MBA program. She's also a Queen's University IRC facilitator for 2 of our programs and serves on the board of governors of a private school. Today's topic is one that does come up frequently in our conversations with HR professionals and organizational leaders. So sit back, grab your note-taking tools, and let's dive into today's session. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Lola.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I'm Tom, who's in the background. I know you're there running everything, so thank you. I will dive straight in, but before I do that, I want to start on a note of gratitude. Thank you so much to Queens for the opportunity to talk about something near and dear to my heart. So I'm currently in Coburg. So I have put the land acknowledgement on here, and I do want to end on a note of we're all treaty people. So as Lindsay said at the beginning, also very respectful of the lands that we can learn, live, and play on. A little bit about me, which Lindsay has spoken to already. And I wanted to start on the note of the problem with HR metrics today. So this is the problem according to Lola. So most organizations, we collect people data. A lot of our organizations do, whether we're public sector, private sector, not-for-profit. But what we see is that very few organizations use it to drive decisions. And this is where the sweet spot and the magic is. So the role of HR as a strategic enabler can contribute to the choice of the metrics that is being used or overlooked. And metrics often track activity, not just outcomes. You know, sometimes they impress, but they're not influential. And a lot of times we see that they exist without a clear business purpose. So the key takeaway, and if you don't remember anything at all from today, we need to take away the fact that data provides very, very useful insights, but it should lead to action through decision making. So we'll start off with a poll. And I would like us to please respond to the question, how would you describe the current maturity of HR metrics and analytics in your organization? So if you think you're advanced, please pick option one, meaning data and analytics are embedded in decision making, predictive models and dashboards are in regular use. Intermediate, if you feel some analytics are used. So for example, you've got dashboards or trend reporting, but not consistently embedded. And then please pick basic if metrics are mostly descriptive and reporting focused with very, very limited strategic impact. So I'll give us a minute to vote.
Just another 10 seconds or so, and then I'll close this up.
Thank you, Lindsay. Ooh, so these are interesting. Okay. So a few of us are using data and analytics at an advanced level. The bulk of us, about 49%, intermediate, and lots of opportunities around metrics and using it for strategic impact decision making and actions. So this is really, really good. Thank you so much. And there are a couple more polls coming on. So please voice your opinion and your response when that time comes. So why strategic HR metrics matter? Why do we even bother? For a couple of reasons. It can shape attention, behavior, and decisions, because we said at the beginning that the power in HR metrics is the ability to use it to drive strategic decisions and also to take action. What HR measures signals what the organization truly values. So if your organization is measuring engagement, it's a signal and is indicative that, you know, the empowerment and engagement of your people is important because you measure. One of someone who's way more clever than I am, Peter Drucker, has a famous saying that I love. He says, you cannot improve what you don't measure. So that ability to measure drives, and it should be correlated with the decisions that are being made. And metrics don't just track strategy. They can actually help to reinforce or to distort strategy. And by distort, I mean it can, you know, leave folks distracted about what are we focusing on, but ultimately the right metrics strengthen HR's credibility and influence. So as HR professionals, we're coming to the table, we're helping people leaders make decisions. It should be grounded in data, and we should be helping make evidence-based decision making. So what determines organizational effectiveness? A couple of things. This is a non-exhaustive list. Productivity, obviously, risk reduction capability, service delivery, trust and engagement. I really want to emphasize on trust and engagement because we know that trust and engagement has it's directly related to the ability for folks to feel empowered. And when they feel empowered, there's discretionary effort. And evidence tells us that discretionary effort has a positive correlation with productivity. So if you want to perform here, let's build trust, let's build engagement, let's help people feel empowered. And naturally, I mean, with a couple of other variables like hiring for values and all of that, you get people performing at their best. So a key takeaway here is that strategic HR metrics can help achieve organizational effectiveness, and we'll talk about the conditions that sort of help enable that as we go along. So a few things that we will touch on today: how we position HR metrics as a strategic enabler, not just fancy data points and dashboards. We're going to talk a little bit about how we link that to decision making, which is where the magic happens. We'll identify people metrics that truly matter. We'll talk about how to select those metrics, and I'll throw in a little golden question that I'll hope everyone will walk away and remember. We'll talk about how we avoid, some common vanity metric traps. And by vanity metrics, I mean metrics that are there for the sake of being there, and they're not driving decisions, they're not driving behaviors, they're not driving attention. What are we using these for? And then we'll talk about HR data to inform decisions, focus trends, and demonstrate impact. And then we'll talk a little bit on how to communicate. So we have the metrics is driving decisions. Let's not forget that a key skill as well is the ability to communicate credibly to leaders what the metrics are telling us. So HR metrics versus evidence-based HR. What are metrics? Essentially, they're what we measure. They're numbers, rates, and counts. So anyone who's worked with me will know that if you give me a metric with a number, I'm going to ask you the N. So by N, I mean if you say, well, 70% of the staff completed their engagement survey. I'll say how many people completed. 70% of 10 people is different from 70% of 100 people. So having those rates add context to the data. So something for us to think about as HR professionals or as people who are contributing to conversations of this nature. Evidence-based HR involves using metrics to answer a business question. We've talked about informing decisions. It should drive behaviors and it should improve outcomes. So if you're measuring HR metrics or you're looking at HR metrics, you should be asking yourself, what is the business question? What decision is this informing? What behaviors is this changing or encouraging? And what outcomes are being improved? So a key takeaway here is the metrics are most valuable when they influence action. And then we're going to keep coming back to this. And hopefully we'll walk away. If we don't walk away with anything else, you need to walk away with metrics should drive action and influence decision making for it to be most effective. So I said earlier on that I mentioned a golden question. So I often get asked, how do we know the right set of metrics for my organization or for your organization? And in my mind, it involves asking the golden question. And this is Lola's golden question. And it's the most important question when you're considering HR metrics. And essentially, it's the business question. What is the problem we're trying to solve? It's a very simple question. It seems very, very intuitive and very, very obvious. But sometimes, when we deal with metrics and data, it's easy to get lost and, can't see the wood for the trees, and we've forgotten what was the problem we're trying to solve. So when an organization approaches me or when colleagues talk to me and say, oh, Lola, what kind of metrics should I be looking at? The first question I ask is, what is the problem your organization is trying to solve? What is the problem that the metrics or the knowledge of the metrics is trying to solve? And so the metric that is the right metric for your organization answers the golden question of what is the problem we're trying to solve. And also it should respond to operational risk or strategic concerns, not just curiosity alone. So if someone wants to measure a fancy metric around transfer of learning, how do we know that people who've gone through learning have transferred the learning? What metric are we looking at? What operational business question is this responding to? Is there a strategic concern, not just about satisfying curiosity alone? Okay, so some examples of golden questions. Are we staffing safely? Perfect question. So if you're asking yourself as an organization, are we staffing safely? Some of the things that you might want to be thinking about is, what are our critical roles? What is the vacancy rate in those critical roles, if they are critical roles? What does overtime look like? What are our employee or staff to customer or to patient ratio or workload ratios? What is our absence rate? Safety incidents or near misses linked to understaffing. So when you're thinking an example of a business question, the golden question, which is what is the problem we're trying to solve? And then you're thinking, oh, is the question, are we staffing safely? Then it informs the metrics that kind of sits underneath. So another example of a golden question, are our people engaged? And why does it even matter? A lot of us, our organizations are in customer service roles. Either we're delivering a good service to a customer or to our clients or to the users of our service. So the questions we want to be asking ourselves are, what is our employee engagement? Are we doing pulse surveys? What is voluntary turnover rate? In my organization, during the pandemic, we looked at turnover within the first year. Very important for us in our context because there was a question of how do we retain folks? So that was the business question there. Absenteeism rate, engagement rate versus performance rate, retention correlations. And a lot of us would have heard about the employee net promoter score as a way of a loyalty test. It's not the end all be all, but it can sometimes provide a little bit of a litmus. Another question, Do our people have the tools and training to perform effectively? So if this is a question we're thinking about, then you should be suggesting, what are your training completion rates? What is the time to proficiency for new hires? What kind of skills or capability gaps exist? Where are you seeing that transfer of learning? So for instance, a practical example, you're looking at workplace violence in your organization. You've put in training. Are those incidents going up? Are the complexities of the incidents changing as a function of the training? This is where you start to unpack what particular metric you're looking at. So let's pick another question. Is our workforce diverse? Is it reflective of the customers we serve? Why is this even important? So then you should be thinking about, what does your representation look like? What do hiring practices look like? Performance practices, turnover rates by demographic groups, pay equity, leadership diversity ratios. And then, it then helps you select what are the metrics we want to look at under this business question. And then finally, where are our workforce risks emerging? So remember our slide before, we said that HR metrics should be addressing risks, operational needs, and then you can look at, are there particular spots within the organization that the turnover is high? How come everyone in Lola's team only stays for 6 months or doesn't pass their probation? Is there something there that needs to be unpacked? Retirement eligibility, critical role vacancies, bench strength, engagement or well-being trend declines. This is where you start to unpack it. So I've put on here just a couple of golden questions and what they look like in practicality. And a key takeaway is start with the golden question. What is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And then the definition of what is the right metrics will automatically follow. So let's talk about vanity metrics. So vanity metrics mean these are metrics that are the direct opposite of what you get if you didn't ask the golden question. They're not tied to a business question. They might be good in and of themselves or look great on a textbook or on paper, but they're not tied to anything. So they look impressive, they don't drive change. Sometimes they're chosen because they're easy to access, and it just feels convenient as a way of, let's just put this on here. And they do not support organizational culture or strategy. And as I said earlier, they're metrics for the sake of metrics. So what I've often seen as well is sometimes metrics have started off as being an answer to a golden question, but over time the business has changed, the needs have evolved, the workforce demographic looks and feels different. And what started off as a great metrics has kind of slipped and is now a vanity metric. So all this to say that don't be shy to every once in a while, just the way you check your car, make sure it's still working, you do a bit of housekeeping, you put away your winter clothes, you bring out your summer clothes, do an audit of your metrics every now and then and say, what are we measuring? Is this still fit for purpose? Does it still answer a business need? Does it still answer the question of what is the problem we're trying to solve? So it is poll time. The next poll question is, what primarily drives the metrics your organizations track today? So is it answering clear business or risk questions? Is it to meet reporting or compliance requirements? Because the data is easy to access, we track a lot of metrics. It's unclear how they're used, and that's not a bad thing. So we'll give us a few seconds to respond.
Good. 10 more seconds for everyone to get their answers in.
Thank you, Lindsay. I thought about asking for music during this, but we haven't got enough time. I don't want to horrify anyone by trying to sing, so. Okay, let's see. Oh, so great. So a lot of us are tracking questions. A lot of us are tracking metrics to answer clear business questions, really strong percentage there. A lot of us also track reporting metrics to meet reporting or compliance requirements, which I think every organization would have the metrics they're tracking. You know, you want to track workplace incidents because you have to, report to the Ministry of Labor. You're meeting a compliance requirement or statutory or obligatory requirement. So that's fine because the data is easy to access, and that's fair. And a lot of us track metrics and we're not clear, where they're used. And I do want to say that the last result doesn't necessarily mean they're not being used. Sometimes we just don't have line of sight into where the data is feeding to and what decisions it's making. So thank you for participating in that poll. Very, very interesting to see. So let's talk about a couple of common vanity metric examples. So we track engagement scores, there are no actions. If we're putting our surveys and we're tracking engagement, you want to see a high completion rate. You also want to see the responses to questions. Hopefully your questions, have a rich mix of, demographics and psychological safety, health and safety, information about their supervisor, information about the work culture. Do they feel they're participating in decision making? Do they feel they have the tools and resources or training to do their jobs? But then you gather all this data, which is great in and of itself, and then it leads to no action, no decisions, no action. I would suggest that a great metric on paper has now become a vanity metric because it's not being used or tied to or associated with an actionable outcome that should change behavior or improve outcomes. So sometimes I've seen training hours without the evidence of capability change. So we're providing training. We're training Lola on how to do A, B, C, and D. But then we're seeing that each time Lola goes through the training or each time the new hires go through a training, we're not seeing a change in capability. But then we're saying, oh my God, but our training completion rate is 98%, but there's no change in capability. People are not better off because of the training they received. Again, I would suggest all of a sudden you've got a great metric that looks great on paper, but it's not driving capability change. So do we need to look at it? Do we need to assess? Again, a question we should ask ourselves. So we tracked time to hire without the quality of hire or new hire turnover. So a time to hire is short, we get people in, but then someone needs to be looking at the other end and say, what does attrition look like? Why are people leaving within the first 3 months? How come everyone who joins Lola's team is leaving within 6 weeks? This is where we have a great metric, but then sometimes it can become a vanity metric. And then sometimes we have dashboard overload. There are all these colors, it's pretty, it's green and red and yellow, and then there are no decisions being made. The ones that are green, how do we keep them green? Do we need to apply the principles of quality improvement and reduce the target so that we have a stretch? Or what are we looking at? The ones that are red, what is the path to green? And it's not driving those conversations. So a key takeaway for this part of the webinar is making sure that there are actionable decisions associated with the metric. You need to ask yourself, are we measuring vanity metrics? Is something that started off as a good idea become a vanity metric? So what strategic metrics look like? Strategic metrics, as we said, no surprises, decision-oriented. They should be clearly linked to outcomes. So again, don't forget the golden question. What is the problem we're trying to solve? It should enable leaders to act differently, and it also helps to strengthen HR's role as a strategic partner. So for instance, you're seeing a lot of high turnover in Lola's area. My HR person or my business partner or someone who's looking at the metrics should be able to say, hey, Lola, what is happening in this area? Do we need to unpack things a bit more? How is it onboarding? Is it training? Where are there opportunities? This is where it's linked to helping the leaders to act differently, is linked to outcomes where the tenure is improved, and it also strengthens HR's role as a strategic partner. So HR metric measurement can be a form of strategy execution and also a very strong culture enabler. So let's talk about the right mix of metrics, HR metrics. So the way that I like to explain this is, think about a balanced diet. You're going for a meal. You want it to have veggies, you want to have carbs, protein. You want to walk away from that meal and think, okay, cool. I have all my food groups in there, balanced diet. I have everything I need. And so the right mix of HR metrics is a great combination of leading, operational and lagging metrics. So by lagging indicators or lagging metrics, let me go the other way around. Leading indicators or leading metrics, it starts with predicting the future, risk, opportunity. So for example, we're looking at vacancies associated with critical roles. We're thinking ahead, thinking, oh, what are the metrics that will tell us, answer this business question, and what do we need to put in place? Operational indicators reflect current state. What is our sickness absence? How long are people off sick? This is a good example of an operational indicator or operational metric. And then the lagging is the reflective or the retrospective trend. How long does it take for us to hire folks end to end from the day the advert gets posted to the day Lola starts the role? So thinking about a balanced diet, you should have a good combination of leading indicators, operational indicators, and the lagging indicators. So I've thrown on this slide a couple of key HR metrics by functional area. This is a non-exhaustive list. And, when we think about recruitment, for example, so I'll pick recruitment and I'll deep dive into recruitment as a functional area and what kind of metrics can sit under when you're thinking about leading, operational, and lagging. So let's pick recruitment as just a random example. So an example of leading indicators will be, okay, so how do we predict future risk? What is the pipeline strength for critical roles? Offer acceptance rate, how many times are people declining the offers that we put out? What's the time to fill trend for hard to hire roles? Candidate dropout rate during assessment stages? EVP brand indicators, the career site, how many people come and look at the site, application conversion rate. So essentially, what this will tell a leader is, are we likely to fill roles on time, or are there risks emerging? All under recruitment and all under leading indicators. So again, staying with recruitment as an example that we're deep diving into, what kind of operational indicators? Current state. So essentially, what's happening here or now? How many open requisitions do we have? Average time in the hiring stage. How long is that end to end when you map it out? How much time is spent in each stage of the recruitment process? Interview to offer ratio. Recruiter overload. How many requisitions per recruiter do we have? If we have, talent acquisition specialists or recruiters that are helping. Hiring manager response time. You know how you put the advert out and then you need to pin the manager down to book an interview, dates, and all of that. So thinking about what is happening here or now and how do we improve that? Again, sticking with recruitment, we've talked about leading indicators, operational indicators. An example of lagging indicators. So lagging indicators, as we said, is that retrospective look back. What was the end-to-end hiring time from start to finish? Cost per hire, quality of the hire, new hire turnover rate or early attrition, and hiring manager satisfaction. So if we work in organizations where our internal customers can rate the services they're getting, how satisfied was the hiring manager with the process? And so this tells leaders, did our recruitment strategy deliver the outcomes we wanted? So that's just recruitment alone. And then if you even wanted to get interesting and pass out recruitment to onboarding, how do you tie all of those in? What are the leading indicators? What are the operational indicators? What are the lagging indicators? Again, don't forget that whatever it is that we're measuring has to answer a business question, which is the golden question. What's the problem we're trying to solve? And then it also has to drive decisions and actions. So not all metrics are strategic. Selection matters. And then we talked about that on slide 12 and slide 14. So whenever I have conversations and people be like, oh, what do I measure? I get super excited. I'm like, okay, cool. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? What behaviors and all of that? And then we land on a set of leading, operational, and lagging metrics. So HR metrics is a strategic choice. HR metrics are a choice. And I say they're a choice because the decision needs to be made actively about what are we going to measure? What are we not measuring? What are we focusing on? And as HR professionals or people who have proximity with the HR profession, we often play a role in being able to influence those conversations and those decisions. So we can often find ourselves at tables where we're discussing what do we want to measure, what influences decision making, what enables culture and strategy. That's why having this information on our fingertips in our back pocket would help us in those conversations as we're influencing people. But also a cautionary word around choosing the wrong metrics can have unintended consequences. People are switching off. It's not telling us what we want to know. We can't make any decisions. And so, for example, in performance measuring, I've seen some performance metrics where all that folks measure are just the watts. How many sales did Lola make today? Let's forget the fact that Lola left carnage behind her with a bad attitude and she's terrible to work with. She rubs everyone the wrong way. Let's just measure the watts and we forget to measure the how. So, again, this is how our understanding of what is the problem we're trying to solve, how is this going to drive action, how is this going to contribute to the culture, this is where that knowledge all comes in. So using HR metrics to drive decisions. So strategic HR metrics, as we've said, can be a very, very strong enabler to supporting evidence-based decision making. So what roles are being hired into and how? What are our hiring practices? What is important to us when we're hiring? Our values as an organization important? How is that reflected in our hiring practices, our performance practices, our discipline practices? So it supports evidence-based decision making. If you're hiring into technical roles because you work in an organization that's super technical, how are you assessing the technical skills and capabilities, the knowledge, the experience? How are we assessing all of that? This is where strategic HR metrics can be a strong enabler. It also helps to drive accountability. So, for instance, we're addressing new hire turnover and low performance. So, remember I said earlier, everyone in Lola's team, you know, resigns after 6 months. This is the data for someone to come and sit down and say, hey, Lola, you know what's happening? Is this a capability issue? Is this a conduct issue? Does Lola need some leadership development? Or do we need to have a conversation with Lola about X or Y to improve her new hire experience? Is it training? Is it workload? And so using HR metrics strategically helps to drive accountability in a manner that is quite objective. It can help to identify workforce risks and capability gaps. So, for instance, training, compliance, transfer of learning. Earlier on, I used the example of workplace violence, where training people to be able to deal with workplace violence. How are we seeing the training compliance? Are we seeing the incidents are increasing? The complexity is increasing? Are we seeing transfer of learning? So we can help as an organization to identify risks and capability gaps. It can also help to forecast trends and inform planning. So there are predictive workforce tools that can be used as planning, as a distinct capability. And I say a distinct capability because that is a bigger conversation around the use of technology and automation and how it helps with the predictive workforce planning. But say, for instance, you're looking at metrics and you say, hey, this is the turnover rate for my organization, this is the sickness absence rate, but we also know that we're growing by X percentage and our customer base is growing by Y percentage. What does our workforce in the future need to look like? These are the kind of conversations that can help through the strategic use of HR metrics. It can also, as we said, help to improve organizational effectiveness. So with respect to engagement, employee, labor relations. So I know I didn't deep dive into labor or employee relations where we talked about the functional areas. But then, if you're looking at how many investigations, how many grievances, how many workplace violence, cases are being looked at, that provides a richness of data that can help us deep dive and say, okay, let's unpack this again. What's the problem we're trying to solve? What decision is this going to influence or action this is going to change? Okay, we've got another webinar. You'll be pleased to know this is the last webinar poll here. And the question is, how often do HR metrics in your organization directly influence leadership decisions? So often, regularly inform strategic operational decisions. Sometimes they're discussed, but don't always change outcomes. Rarely. Metrics are reviewed, but have very, very little influence. And I'm just not sure. I'm not sure how metrics are actually used. So take a couple of seconds.
We'll leave it for maybe another 5 to 10 seconds here.
Another 5 to 10 seconds. Thank you, Lindsay. Oh, okay. So not sure. I'm not sure how metrics are used, about 15%, which again is not an indicator that they're not being used. We just might not have line of sight. So rarely. Metrics are reviewed but have very little influence. So here is where, there are opportunities for us to influence those conversations, drive the culture around the thinking of metrics and how it can actually play a role in strategic HR decision making. And then sometimes, most of the time, I see sometimes where they're discussed, but they don't always change outcomes. So we know that, engagement is low, but what are we doing? The action plans are not strong and it's still low. So sometimes you see it moving the needle, other times it doesn't. And it's really great to see the 4% of us said that metrics regularly inform strategic operational decisions. That's really great to see. So great insights there. Thank you. So communicating metrics that influence. So we talked about metrics. We've said, what is the problem it's trying to solve? The golden question. How does it influence actions, decisions? How do we avoid vanity metrics, which is metrics for the sake of metrics? How do we pick a balanced diet of metrics, leading, operational, lagging? And now let's assume that we've done all of those perfectly. We've answered the question, we've picked the metrics. How do we then communicate metrics that influence? So to influence leaders, we need to communicate HR metrics in a manner that provides context, not just data. So remember when I said at the beginning, we say, oh, 75% have completed the survey. Well, 75% of how many? And if it's 75% of 10, okay, maybe we have a little bit more work to do. If 75% of 1,000, okay, now that is really excellent. So when we're communicating that influence of HR metrics, doing it without context is, in my mind, like plating of food and not worrying about the appearance, just slapped on the plate and it's all over the place. So that context is really, really key. We're not just providing data, we're providing context. So we took metrics about XYZ, but we did it during, summer months or during winter pressures. And so that context adds richness into how folks and leaders understand and are able to assimilate the data. It should present a clear argument. So are we saying there are opportunities around hiring and time to hire? Or are we saying we're doing a good job and we need to stay the course? Or are we saying, oh, there are opportunities for being even more efficient if we include technology? So it has to present a clear argument. And as people who are often custodians of the data, or we find ourselves in situations where we're presenting the data, you need to ask yourself, what is the argument? What is the story I'm telling? It should focus on implications and decisions again, because we said for it to be strategic, it has to influence decisions and actions. So we really need to think about those implications. It should also help highlight the implications of the trade-offs or the opportunity cost. And for this, I simply mean what I'm trying to say here is if we do nothing, and then what happens? So we're looking at training compliance rates. Training compliance is low, 10%. Mandatory training, folks are not completing their training. We've talked about the context of the data. We've presented a clear argument and say, hey, we really need to get those training numbers up, because when our evidence tells us that, when people are trained and they're more, their capability and resources are fully maximized, what are the implications? What are the decisions? But also the trade-offs or the opportunity cost, which is the alternative for gone. If we don't focus on this, here is a risk. If we don't focus on this, this might happen. It's also credible, transparent, relevant, and easy to follow. So by credibility, and this is something that I wouldn't be able to go into in that much depth here, but then the data has to be credible. People have to look at the data and have to understand and align with the data. So this is where we talk about on the HR metrics and analytics program, we talk about, where's the source of truth? Do people's competence and ability and data literacy, is it all at the same level? Is it transparent? Is it easy to follow? If someone is put in a data set in front of you and say, this is the vacancy rate, what is the formula that sits behind it? What is your denominator? How are you calculating it? So communicating metrics should have a peppering of all of these points, but equally importantly, it should be credible, it should be transparent, it should be relevant, and it also has to be easy to follow. I'm sure we've all been in situations where people put up data in front of us and you're like, okay, what am I looking at? Like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. What am I supposed to be seeing? So the key takeaway is, leaders want answers to their questions, not just the dashboard. So we can use the opportunity to use those dashboards to increase awareness and all of that. So we're getting near the end. From HR metrics to impact, a couple of questions for us to ask ourselves. What decision did this metric inform? So let's assume, we have metrics already and you want to do an audit on the effectiveness of it. What did it inform? What decision did it help with? How did it help? Going back to the golden question, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What behaviors were changed? As a result of this data, I tweaked my training for my new hires to create a sleeker onboarding experience. It changed the behavior. What outcomes did it improve? Oh, by doing X or Y differently because of the data, I can see that my turnover has reduced. What does that look like? What culture was culture enabled? When we talked about the hows and the what's under performance, how has this enabled the culture of, oh, the culture in our organization is, we want to promote what people think, we want to be respectful. How has this enabled that? And how did the strategy advance? So a key takeaway that I'd like to leave us with is, this is how HR truly demonstrates value and impact, using data, using HR metrics and the functionalities of analytics to tell a story, to drive decision making, and to improve outcomes. So bringing it all together, metrics play a huge role in shaping strategy, behavior, and culture. Don't forget the golden question. Think about your metrics, avoid vanity metrics, do a little bit of housekeeping. What do we measure? Is it still fit for purpose? A balanced set of indicators is always better. Remember our leading, operational, and lagging. Communication of metrics is just as important because we want it to influence decision-making and drive actions. And evidence-based HR metrics definitely strengthens HR's credibility as a profession. So a couple of reflections that I'd like to leave us with. Which HR metrics in your organizations need to be rethought and why? What set of metrics will you commit to when you're evaluating or redesigning to better support strategic decision-making in your organization? So essentially, as an option of what we've heard today, what are you going to commit to looking at or redesigning or evaluating? And leaving us with those reflections, I will turn it over to Lindsay.
This has been great. It's been wonderful to, hear all of your expertise. So getting into some questions here. I have one here that says, what advice would you give to someone just starting the journey of creating an HR data strategy and roadmap, especially in an organization where the maturity of HR metrics varies across teams?
Great question. So the advice I will give is map out your strategy. Do a 3-year strategy roadmap and say in year 1, what I want to achieve is baseline of data competence, for instance, because you don't want to land on data sets and then people don't know what to do with it. So map out your strategy, put some fundamental building blocks in place. Data literacy, alignment on the source of truth, because you don't want credibility challenges down the road, and then start small. I always say, it's an iterative process. Start small so that you can fail fast. So the concept of failing fast is, you can fail in little incremental steps because then you can recover. So think about, your plan, do, study, act, and that continuous iteration. So I would say definitely start with a foundation. Let's think about data literacy. How are we going to use the data? Let's get alignment. I found that it's very difficult to measure HR metrics without our finance counterparts. The number of times we've argued on what's the difference between headcount and FTE, and you want to get alignment on all of those before you start putting dashboards out. And then don't forget the golden question. What's the problem we're trying to solve? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And then don't be shy to start small and then build on from there. So hopefully that has answered the question and giving you some tips.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have another one here. It says, I find it difficult to measure and get metrics for things such as transfer of knowledge after employees complete their training. Do you have any suggestions for this?
So that's a very interesting question. So there's some metrics we call proxy measures. You might not get a direct X equal Y, but you're saying that, oh, because I'm looking at this, you're looking at that. I found the transfer of learning it's one that is a bit tricky. And the way that I have approached it, and I've encouraged people to approach it, is what are the proxy metrics data points that you're looking at? So say, for instance, let's use training, as you said. We've trained Lola on how to deal with difficult situations in the workplace. Therefore, workplace violence should reduce. Or does it increase and the complexity reduces? So you really need to unpack the data points and think about your good mix of objective data points and the anecdotal. But transfer of learning is one where you have to accept that there's a proxy measure. And this is where, when you're talking about, data literacy and getting everyone at the same baseline, what's the margin of error? What are we going to accept to the degree possible that X equals Y? But then sometimes with training, it can be more explicit. So if we've trained Lola how to do a workflow that has 5 steps, how many times does she make an error? That's a bit more direct. So I would say map it out and say, what are we measuring and how does it help to answer? But with transfer of learning, I find that it can be a bit tricky, and you have to really look at it and align with, sometimes the business line or the leaders we're working with to say, how do we look as X telling us a function of Y? So lots of iteration.
Oh, that's great. Another question here says, what role does storytelling play when communicating HR data?
Oh my God, a huge role. Huge, massive, huge, massive. When I do my session on metrics and analytics, I also approach it from the angle of how not to tell a story. And I don't know if it's only me. I'm sure we've all seen the dashboards where, first of all, it's like a fusion of color. And you're thinking, okay, what am I looking at? Or you look at the points, and the axes aren't even lined, and you're seeing a graph that looks like this. Is like, is it going up? Is it going down? Like, what's the context? Like, that unit metric doesn't align with that one. And Lindsay at the beginning said, my first degree is in economics and statistics. Storytelling is a huge part, because to us it kind of makes sense sometimes, and there's that proximity, you're very close to it. But the ability to tell story means that you understand who your audience is, what do they need to see, and your ability to change altitude. Is this 30,000 feet in the air, or are we going to dive down into the detail? So huge. Storytelling is a whole huge element, because this is another area where I see we often let ourselves down, because you've done all this work, you've created alignment, it's driving decisions, and then you have the opportunity to discuss it at a senior leadership team, and then you get Lola asking you, what am I looking at? And that doesn't add up to that. So storytelling is a huge piece that helps with our ability to communicate what the data is telling us.
Wonderful. Another question here. It says, how do you manage leaders' requests for more data while staying focused on measuring only what truly supports the decision making?
That's a very, very true question. I worked in an organization where, we had a center of excellence, and I was a business partner, and my business area just wanted more and more. And I remember I sat with the head of analytics, and they said, okay, look, Lola, we're going to give you X, Y, Z. I'm going to teach you how to run a report. So you can run a report each time you need an extra result. So I think that collaboration is the point I'm trying to underscore. So what is the problem they're trying to solve? And does the information they have provide that? Sometimes I always encourage that with HR metrics, it's a do with, not a do for. sometimes we can help empower the leaders to look at their own data points, especially if they're looking for bespoke or customized data. However, if it's like a business need where, oh, in this particular business area we have a risk, then there might be the need. But if it's just more for the sake of more, I think it begs a conversation around, okay, let's go back to the golden question. What are we trying to solve? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Do we have enough? Do we need more? And having that alignment on how much is enough and how much is, oh, why don't I show you how to run the report? Or, okay, let's have a conversation and find a middle ground. So this is where we use our compromising skills as professionals to say, oh, okay, so what is the problem we're trying to solve and how much of enough is enough?
Very good. Um, just have a couple more questions here. So this one says, if HR teams could only track three categories of metrics, which would you prioritize?
Oh my God, that's a hard question. Which three? Okay, I would say you want to track something about recruitment. Who's coming in, when, how long does it take? So recruitment, I will definitely track. I will definitely track offboarding, those regrettable leaves, the turnover, the people who didn't pass their probation, the people who, left for other reasons. And then I will track engagement. So if you put me on an island and say, Lola, you can only have three, I will track those three, but I would be so sad and I would find a compromise with you about saying, hey, can I add on a little more? But those three, I think, will give you a fundamental baseline of what is happening with the workforce. And then you can tack everything on. That is a super brilliant question and one that I hope no one ever makes me commit to because I would be so sad. Why?
I think you answered it very well.
Okay.
Okay, and so our last one here, it says, in your opinion, how many metrics are too many for leaders to realistically act on?
It depends. It depends on what the organization is, what is the strategic direction of the organization. Sometimes I say less is more. If the metrics are, if they're related, it's easy to move the needle in a big swim lane, but you're ticking off a few as you go along. Also, there are other things that would influence that around the capacity of folks, change fatigue, strategic drive and priorities. Is this compliance related? How many people do you have? We've all heard the saying, many hands make work light. If you have the capability, then maybe you can do more. And so that's an it depends question on a lot of variables. But if it's a small team and again, you don't want to boil the ocean, you don't want to do a lot and not have impact. So it depends on a whole range of variables, but also it depends on the workforce and are the leaders where they are in their leadership journey and maturity. The leaders are mature, maybe they can handle a bit more on the go. If you're building your leadership development capability, maybe a little too much will be confusing. So it depends on a whole range of things, and so I would say it depends.
Well, wonderful. Well, if there aren't any other questions, might just give it another minute or so here. But I do want to give a big thank you to Lola for leading us through such a great session today and really sharing your expertise. I think you've answered some tough questions for us. Hopefully everyone's leaving with some really practical ideas that they can be able to apply right away. And just as a reminder, you will be receiving a recording of this webinar via email, so please feel free to share it out to your community of learners. And if you're interested in further building these skills and learning more from Lola, please check out our HR metrics and analytics program, as well as our aligning HR and business strategy program. So I don't see any other questions here. So on behalf of Queen's University IRC, I thank you for spending a part of your day with us. We really do appreciate your time and your engagement. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you so much.